Hello. Hello, everybody. So it's Friday. You know the drill. Phones, evaluation forms. Sorry, got to tell you. Hello. Thanks so much for coming to my session. I realize it's Friday. Everyone's tired. I know I am. Adventure party was fun last night. But I tried to keep to one beer. Anyway, my name is Joseph Humphrey. I'm co-founder of Inkle. We're a small game studio based in the UK, in Cambridge. We specialize in narrative games. Thankfully for us, narrative seems to be really in vogue right now, which is super exciting. And it's indies especially, I think, that are really pushing the boat out in terms of storytelling, which is great. For me, like there's been this narrative revolution that seemed to start, well, for me personally, I got really excited around the time of Indigo Prophecy, or Fahrenheit, as it's called in the UK. It was kind of the game for me that started to suggest that we could do more in storytelling in games than what had been done before with like hub-based narrative dialogue trees and stuff. But it's great to see that we're all using so many more different techniques, and it's really exciting. So I'm a programmer by trade. But being indie, we all do loads of different jobs. So I'm also an art director. I do UI design. I do a good chunk of the game design as well, which I work on with my co-founder, John Ingold, who's really responsible for the kind of the narrative at Inkle. He's the narrative expert. He does a lot of the writing. He also does most of the game design. But increasingly, we're working with other writers and contractors as well. So most notably, Meg Giant, who's sitting here at the front, looking very embarrassed. And she did most of the writing on 80 Days. And all of our games so far have had one piece of core technology underlying them. And we didn't realize that this would happen when we founded the company, but it's really been a piece of technology which has been at the core of our company, including 80 Days. And that piece of technology is ink. So 80 Days is a game that we originally made for iOS. It has you attempting to circumnavigate the globe in 80 days or less, as in the novel by Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. The main hook is that you can go anywhere you like. There are 170 cities in the game. Each one has bespoke narrative content. You can go between the cities, and every single journey between those cities has bespoke narrative content. So when you string these things together and you choose your own route around the globe, you end up with your own unique story. So it's kind of an insanely branching narrative. And while that's not the explicit intention, it's not like we set out to just create an insanely branching narrative. What we set out to do was create an adventure in which you get your own unique story. It just so happens that we constructed it in that way. And when you go on a single route around the globe, you might only see around 5% of the total content in the game, which is kind of crazy. So structurally speaking, the game is built a bit like a board game. You go from city to city. It's like advancing over a game board in the shape of a globe. But where you might get a descriptive card, like a chance card or something like that in a board game, we have a complete story flow, which is branching in and of itself. And it's presented entirely in text, as you can see. So if you want to be reductive, you could say it's a choose-your-own-adventure. And yes, so I guess it's a choose-your-own-adventure, sort of, but come on. We like to think there's a little bit more to it than that. And so it might not surprise you that we're not especially fond of that comparison, but it does help you cut to the chase and say this is the type of game that it is. So there is a total of 650,000 words in the game. roughly. It's really hard to know what that really means. I'm not a writer myself. I don't really know what to make of that kind of number, but apparently it's about the same as if you combined The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. And we've tried using different tools to count this number, and it generally kind of comes out at the same number each time. But I'd love to kind of print out a tome which has all of the 80 days content, just so I can feel the weight of it in my hands. So across all of our games, we've written 2 million words of content. Again, I don't really know what that number really means, but it seems impressive. So one thing we've learned about Ink is that it really is built for scale. It's helped us build every single one of our games, and we haven't really hit any limits apart from I guess, the sanity of our writers. So broadly, in this talk, I want to talk about 3 different points. I want to talk about what it was about Ink that really allowed us to produce this much content for 80 days in Sorcery, and how it was really, it really did allow us to produce that level of branching content for all of the games, and how it is built for scale, and which features made us most productive. Then I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the next version of the language, because the big news for us is that on Friday we went open source with Ink. And so it's going to be available to everyone. We hope that you guys are going to make use of it. So I'll show you a little bit about how the Ink engine works and how you might be able to integrate it into your own game. So first of all, why did we make a scripting language? Why didn't we do something like this? So we didn't want to construct a huge flowchart, whether physically or like using sticky notes on a wall or digitally. We know that when Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone wrote the Fighting Fantasy series, they did produce huge pieces of paper with diagrams of this crazy complex flow. So why didn't we do that? Well, it's just a little bit fiddly. I mean, I don't want to step anyone's toes here, because I know that Twine uses it, and I know that it's used in lots of different fields, including writing shaders and stuff, and it's really powerful in some ways. But for us, when we're changing the flow on a sometimes a word-by-word basis, we're changing direction based on half a sentence or a paragraph. It's just too many connections, too much branching and intertwining of these pieces of content that it would just, again, it would make our writers go insane. So one analogy that I like to think of is it's a little bit like programming. Ask any programmer and they'll tell you it would be easiest if they just wrote it in text-based code. And yes, there are certain applications where it's great to use a graph like this, like building shaders, and some games may have been written purely like this, but we find that with the amount of text content that we're writing, and based on the fact that programming is also done well in text, why can't we do the best of both and just use a text-based format? So if you know anything about our company, or if you know the history of our company, you might know that very early on in our history, we made this tool called Inklewriter. And Inklewriter is kind of semi-visual. Like it's much more friendly than just using an IDE for a programming language, but it's still not a flowchart. It's still broadly you're just writing, and that's kind of what we've set out to do with both Inklewriter and Ink. We want writers to just get on and write. So the unique thing about Inklewriter is we say that you write as you play. So as you play through the game, you're writing paragraph after paragraph, and you make some choices, you follow one of the choices, and then you write the paragraph that's inside that choice. And then you can rewind, choose a different choice, and then write what happens for that choice. So at any particular moment, what you're looking at is one possible linear version of the story, so that it really helps writers think about their stories as in exactly the same way that they would think about writing a novel or a short story. They can just get on and write what they want to write. But of course, you can view a flowchart based on that writing and based on that flow. So this is an example by Emily Short. And it's great for small examples. So this example of hers branches a lot. And that's the most I could really fit on a slide. But it is quite short. There's only a few clicks in there. And that's already getting quite complicated. But this isn't how we wrote 80 Days either. So we used Ink. And it actually predates Inklewriter. It was the first piece of technology that we built for our company. Inklewriter was never meant to be a professional writing tool. It's great for newcomers to interactive writing, and it's been used a lot for teaching in schools, which is awesome. And it's useful for kind of demonstrating our philosophy of the way that we like to write. But it's a web-only based tool, and it's just not great for huge projects. Simple text files, however, are great for large projects. So I'll show you a little sample of what Ink looks like. This is really, really basic stuff. This is an extract from Sorcery, which is our adaptation of the 80s fantasy game book by Steve Jackson. And this is just using some of the really most basic features of Ink. So since this is an adaptation, you'll notice there's an identifier at the top, which identifies a particular paragraph number, because this is based on an old game book where you would turn to a particular section number and you'd follow it from there. So when we did the adaptation, that's the kind of scheme that we stuck with. But because this is Ink rather than the old game book, what John Ingold did when he adapted it is he split it up into smaller sections and then gave those subnames. So we've got the subsections intro, thank, and shove. So in blue, we've got the markup that tells you about the sections and subsections in Ink. And as you've probably worked out by now, the asterisks, the bullets, they indicate choices. And in green, we've got the diverts, which are kind of like go-tos in programming. And they just kind of take you from one section to another and tell the flow where to go. So pretty simple stuff. The tildes, so in orange, that designates a small piece of logic, or it's kind of like traditional programming. And so in this particular example, the game's remembering that the players learned the name of the innkeeper in the town that we're in, who's called Amalek. So very quickly after founding Inkle, one of the main things that we wanted to go for, one of the things that we wanted to make unique for our company was to really try to make the choices a lot more fine-grained. So in a lot of choice-based games, what happens is because they have a high production budget, they end up making huge cutscenes with small numbers of really important choices. Whereas what we wanted to do, and because we were working in the medium of text, we could afford to have thousands of tiny choices so that the player really feels that like they're really interacting at a really fine-grained level. So it's not like they're doing two separate activities of making choices and reading through text. They're really doing one thing, because it becomes, the more you split it up, the more fluid it becomes. So in this particular example, John broke it down into three sections, but in some examples he would expand it massively and really have turn one page of prose into a really massively branching in itself scene where you might, for example, say every line of dialogue that your character says in a quite a complex exchange. So here's how it would be perceived. It would be shown to the player in the game. You see the first paragraph, you get two choices. You might pick thank him, and then it would join together, and you get those two paragraphs together. So this is just, again, it's a really simple example. And so I'll go on to explain a little bit more about how we vary the words on a word-by-word basis in some sentences. So whereas I've talked a little bit about how we can branch the story and go to different paragraphs, sometimes when you see the same paragraph multiple times, if you repeat a piece of content, what you want to do is show a little bit of variability, or not necessarily when repeating content, but also when you want to vary something specifically to how, based on what the player's done in the past. So this is what we call sequences and cycles. If a piece of story is repeated, then the engine will vary the exact wording based on how many times you've seen it. So the first time you'll see this, it'll say you chew through the moss. The second time you see it, it'll say you munch on the moss, and then it will repeat. So then stepping it up in a little bit more in complexity, this is an example of a conditional. So based on what we know about what the player's done in the past, whether they decided to eat the moss in the past, then you can vary the content appropriately. And in this example, we've actually got some nested conditionals. So we've got three possible alternatives that depend on two things. And you might be thinking that those are variables called eat it and taste it, but actually those are the names of subsections that the player might have, or sections that the player might have read in the past. And this is a really important concept for us. What we haven't done is we haven't specifically recorded a variable that says the player decided to eat this. So we haven't typed in a line of programming code saying set this flag to true. All it's doing here is looking to see whether the player has visited a particular section of content in the past. And the benefit of that is that it means that we don't have to remember, the writer doesn't have to specifically mark that up. They can simply, because the game remembers absolutely everything that the player's ever done, we can reference that at any time, in any paragraph, on a word-by-word basis. We can vary what the text content of the game is. So we found that where the player might not be aware a lot of the time of this variability, if you do it enough, and if you reference very specific things to very specific players, then they will get this kind of magical experience where they feel like, how the hell did the game know that I did that? That was so long ago, and that's so specific to what I did. And I like to think of Sorcery as comprised entirely of Easter eggs, so that everything feels special and everything feels like it's related to everything else. So when we take this a step further, when you nest all of these things together, you get something like this, which is sort of approaching procedural narrative. It's not procedural in the sense that the game is inventing an entirely new story for the player. The sentence structure is the same. But what we're doing is we're varying almost everything, in fact, I think everything, based on a combination of things, like how many times has the player seen this content? Did they specifically do this or that? So this is an example from Sorcery 3, where we have this day-night cycle, and the player can choose to go to sleep anywhere in the map, almost, and based on where they are, the features of the landscape might be different. They might have fallen in a river earlier in the story, and that will really affect what happens in the story. So we've got a couple of examples that have been generated from this sort of narrative code, I guess. Laying your pack down by the cliff edge, you try to settle despite the cold wind. And that's really quite different to putting down your pack by the roots of a tree. You try to stretch out despite the shivering cold of your still wet clothing. So it knows that the player was drenched for whatever reason. It knows that they're in a forest, and it knows that they've seen this content before, so it's just varying the wording just to keep it interesting. So you might be thinking, this is a bit technical, right? Not all writers are this technical. And yeah, that's true. But come on, like, how many roles are there in the game industry where we have this split between technical and the opposite of technical? We have technical artists who write shaders, who are really artistic, but we also have concept artists who are just skilled in a different way. But the concept artist can still use Photoshop. They still know Maya. They can use these really super complex tools, but it's just different jobs for different people. And this is how we wrote 80 Days, because Meg was at one end of the spectrum, and John was at the other, and they were both very technical, but John was kind of the narrative architect, I guess you could say. He was the equivalent of a software engineer who constructed the narrative systems. He wrote things like this. And Meg wrote beautiful words using the tools that we supplied, and it was still extremely complex, and she used a feature which I'm going to show you next. But they really complemented each other. So I want to talk a little bit more about the structuring, because previously I showed you this system of having sections and subsections, which I should say we actually call knots and stitches because we have to have our own quaint terminology, and everyone in narrative seems to like using twine and weaving metaphors. So this is called weave. The sections in the past, they were called knots and stitches. So what we've got here is a weave that's called paragraph 198. Again, it's an adaptation of Sorcery. So John had been working with knots and stitches for Sorcery, and he quickly found that as he was trying to split up the content more and more, as I said before, like, he wanted to split it up to really get this kind of fine-grained feeling of interactivity with the text. And the more he did that, the more he felt that he was just being slowed down by the fact that he had to name all of these sections and subsections. So he came up with this format that we found that actually Choice of Games has come up with something really similar. And there's kind of two things which make it distinctive. And it's slightly confusing when you first look at it, but once you've got the hang of it, it's so powerful. And it really surprised me, but Meg absolutely loved this, and it really, really suited the tone of 80 Days, because really early on we came up with this idea that perhaps the player could be finishing sentences. So we've got two parts which are important for that in Weave. And the first is this square bracket notation, which I'll just try to explain briefly. It's quite weird, but once you've got the hang of it, it's really quite powerful. So what these square brackets do is they try to capture the similarity between the choice text and the game output. And in this example, you can see that there's three sections. There's the section before the square brackets, inside, and after. And the Ink engine can use all of those sections and combine them first for the choice. So in this example, it will just be I thank you, but it specifically gets the punctuation right by including the full stop and the end quote. But then in the output, it will have a comma, so it's all fully punctuated correctly. And that's just one example. There are lots of other ways that you can use this square bracket notation. And so, as I said, we use this extensively on 80 Days. So let's take a quick look at what that looked like. This is an example of Meg's writing for Bangalore. And I'm not expecting you to fully kind of parse and understand exactly what's going on here. But what I want to point out is the overall shape of the text and exactly what the ratio is between genuine text content that the writer's written and the amount of punctuation and markup. And because when you look at it, it really does just look like writing. It's just text. It doesn't look like programming, right? It's really quite straightforward. The asterisks look like a kind of a markdown or something. And so if you look at the shape of it, that's what's really important here. But I'll show you how that works with a slightly simpler example. So this is an example of a little story that we've got in our tutorial that we've put online. So it's about a Belgian detective called Poitou. Let's read it out then. Well, Poitou, suicide or murder? And then you can choose suicide or murder. And you can see that there's some indented sections here, and they are they're the content that will be directed to once you choose that option. The dashes at the top and at the very bottom, they kind of demarcate the main sections of the flow. So let's choose murder. Murder. And who did it? Detective Inspector Jape, Captain Hasty, or myself? So now we're in the indented section, and we've got 3 choices. And again, we've got these dashes which demarcate the sections. We call those gather points, and you'll see why in a moment. But basically, once you've run out of flow in a particular section, it will jump out to the nearest gather point. So let's accuse Detective Inspector Jape. Inspector Jape, you must be joking. Mon ami, I'm deadly serious. Or if only. So we've been presented with the remaining 2 choices just below that gather point, those 2 dashes. And if we choose one of those, it should be fairly obvious what happens next, because there's only really one place we can go. But even though it's obvious to our eyes, it's not necessarily obvious to the compiler. Like this is actually some quite complex logic that's happening here. It's jumping in and out of this indented flow fairly sporadically, but what we're not doing is we're not having to link all these sections together. They're all just flowing together naturally. So let's choose if only. Mrs. Christine lowered her manuscript a moment. The rest of the writing group sat, open-mouthed. So the weave has automatically collected the loose ends from whichever section the player happened to finish up at. So they could have taken the suicide option and chosen one of the sub-choices within there, and then it would have jumped down to the bottom. But in this case, it ran through that flow in the second section. So compare that to the previous examples where the writer had to invent labels for their sections, they had to link them up, they had to remember the names of those sections, and instead we've got a naturally chronological flow that does branch out, and it does have choices, and it can do interesting things, but it's really straightforward to write. So from a programming point of view, I don't know how many people in here are programmers versus writers, but from a programming point of view, this is kind of approaching declarative. So whereas in most programming you'll say you have to do exactly this, you have to do that, you have to ask for input at this point, what we're instead doing is we're saying this is the content. I understand the broad shape of it, but I just want the Ink engine to just do its thing and provide the choices at the right point and pop in and out of these indented sections automatically. And that really fits our sensibility for what we were doing on 80 Days. We wanted the scenes to kind of really run fluidly, chronologically, always with a forward momentum, never kind of lingering on a hub where you feel like you have to check out every single hub option. Like I feel when I play some of the older games like Monkey Island, or even more recently Mass Effect, that you get this dialogue tree where you just feel like, okay, I've got to go through each in turn because it's providing those options. Instead, the conversation's always moving forward, and it's moving forward naturally. So the downsides of this was that we started off with this knot and stitch format, the sections and the subsections. But Weave became this kind of sub-format. It was a format within a format. It was starting to get a little bit messy. So despite the fact that we had 2 million words of content written in Ink by this point, we had a number of problems. We wanted to make the Ink engine just more maintainable for the future. We also wanted to start using it in Unity. So so for that to work, we needed to write it in C#. And the original compiler was written by John, it was written by John in Perl. And if you know either John or Perl, you'll understand that there are problems with that. John is brilliant when it comes to design and interactive narrative, but he's not a very experienced software engineer. So this Ink compiler we had was a really hacky script in Perl. Still, it's a testament of his ability that it was still going by the time we finished 80 days. We're also starting to move forward as a company. We're thinking we'd always like to keep a foot in interactive narrative in the style of 80 days. We'd still like to make games like that are really kind of text-focused. But we're also thinking ahead to the future where we might try and increase the production value, have more graphical games, perhaps, real character art, crazy, and dialogue bubbles, perhaps a kind of graphic novel style. And we wanted to make sure that our Ink engine, the text engine that we built, would still be useful for that kind of game, because we really like the workflow that we got going with that. Also, I'm kind of weirdly interested in compilers, because normally I'm a gameplay programmer, I do art direction, I like UI design, but something about compilers, they really get me going. Yeah, because has anyone been watching the Jonathan Blow series? He's making his own language. Yeah, a few people have. It's really good fun. I'm really excited about what he's doing with that language as well. So we couldn't open source the first Ink compiler. It's just a bit too hacky, and it was too bespoke for our own stuff. And with Ink 2, we thought, well, this would be awesome if we could actually go open source with this, because we were kind of aware that actually the primary writing tool in the game industry is Excel for creative writing. It's crazy. It seems to be the most popular tool for writers. I mean, popular. It's not very popular, but it is the most used tool. And we thought, well, if we've got this tool and we've made it, we should really make it available to others. So we started work on a new version of the language, Ink 2. And we've done a few things. We've kind of tidied up the syntax. We've made it much more streamlined. Some things are more structural. So we found a way to combine this knots and stitches structure, the sections and subsections, with weave, so that you can use the best of both seamlessly and together. And then some things are more implementation specific. As I said, we're moving over to Unity, so we've implemented the new version in C#. So I'll just talk a little bit about the pipeline that we've had on both Ink 1 and Ink 2. So we came up with this system where we had John's Perl script, which was compiling to a JSON file, and then on my side, I would load up that JSON file in Objective-C, because that's what we were using at the time to make Sorcery in 80 days. And that was a great separation, because actually John implemented Weave of his own volition without me having to do a thing. He actually he took the weave and he analyzed the structure and he turned it into knots and stitches, which were automatically named. And so we decided to keep the same thing for Ink version 2, just because it allows us this flexibility and also hopefully allows us to keep the runtime side really tight and small, so that hopefully someone in the open source community would be able to make, for example, a JavaScript version that would work in web pages. And in fact, that is one thing that we had on Ink 1. We had both JavaScript and Objective-C implementations, which was super useful. It meant that we could create prototypes of our games in HTML, even though, and keep some of that writing even as we started to develop the game features. Another new feature of Ink 2, and this makes me unbelievably excited, that's kind of the minimal Ink file. It's just pure text. So we've taken it a step further, and we've turned it almost into Markdown for interactive text. So the simplest possible Ink file you can write is just some text. And so if you run that through the entire pipeline, what you'll get at the other end when you run it in the game is just the text. And you can add markup. You can change the way that You can add interactivity and change the flow, but broadly speaking, it's text with markup and code injected into it rather than the other way around, rather than a programming language where you can insert text, maybe in quotes or whatever. So this has kind of been a real goal for us with Ink 2, and it was kind of already there with Ink 1 because John really needed a fluid way to write, but it's been a goal that we wanted to take to the next level for Ink 2 because we wanted people to be able to get started really easily. So this is an example of how we've mixed weave and knots and stitches together. So we've got two options here. The first is with the new weave syntax, which uses the square brackets. And the second option is more of the kind of the traditional style syntax. And in Ink 1, actually, there wouldn't have been any square brackets there at all. And in fact, so that my secret is that all of the examples I've shown you so far are actually Ink 2, so you don't go crazy. So as I said, the first option is weave. So we've got inline square brackets. And if you look at the difference between blue and red in terms of blue is all on the same line, it's all there, whereas red, it has to link to this other section. But we want to keep both because it's still useful to be able to split up your text into these sections and subsections. And while weave is great for a kind of a forward flow, which is always moving forwards, the stitches are really useful for just demarcating different sections and more kind of hub-based formats, because that's really more applicable to other things like if you walk into a room and there are a number of things that you can do and interact with different objects in the room. So we still like both formats, and we found a way to combine them. So now, again, as I said, I like compilers, so I'll tell you some of the counterintuitive quirks of what makes this language interesting. I've already said, like, it is more of a markup than a programming language, and yet it has all the full features of a programming language. Next, very controversially, we kind of like goto. So programmers will tell you that gotos are evil. Goto is when you just jump around all over the code base, you just follow a link anywhere, and what you end up with is spaghetti code. You don't know where you're going to end up. But in narrative, for some stories, I'm not saying this is applicable to everything, but some stories, like Sorcery, it's kind of cool to just end up who knows where and not know how to get back again. And yes, it's partly about structuring your code correctly, and we would definitely encourage you to do that, but actually goto has some really nice affordances in some cases. It's also quite punctuation heavy as a language, although on the previous slides I showed you there's a fairly good ratio of text versus the markup symbols. Compared with a language like BASIC, for example, where you have a lot of keywords, and certainly in form, which is almost completely text-based, we actually like the succinctness of having these very specific symbols which are used in very particular ways. But once you've learned those symbols, and once you're happy with the format, it's extremely efficient, and you're really just focusing on the content. So I'll show you a little bit about how this works on the game side, and this is really cool because what's going on inside the Ink engine can potentially be really complex, but from the game programmer's point of view, it's super easy to get started. You just create a story object, load up the JSON string that's come out of the compiler. And then there's just basically a core loop of you have content, you have choices, and you just jump back and forth between them. And so really the API footprint is really tiny. And yes, there's other features as well. You can have External game functions, so you can write functions in your C# code and then call that directly from Ink. You can observe variables, so whenever a variable changes, like the health of a character, you can directly change that in the UI. But the basics are just really straightforward, and I kind of love that. Like, it's not something that we did particularly intentionally. It's just a nice affordance of the engine. Also, keeping in line with the idea of simplicity, on the first version of the Ink engine, we added all sorts of features like a native way to insert images into your text and all of that kind of thing, and very specific game features for Sorcery. But for Ink 2, we realized that actually you kind of don't need to do all that. It's kind of better to keep the text engine itself really simple so it can really be used as really flexible kind of middleware for your game. So what we don't have is a system for creating dialogue objects or something like that. This is just text. This is just pure text as written by the author in a format that they find convenient to them, that they've agreed with whoever writing the game engine. And so it's really, really simple as a game programmer to take that piece of text and turn that into a dialogue object, or make use of the character's name because you know where it is. You've got the emotion, you've got the colon, you know exactly where everything is, and then you can bring up the character art, you can put the text in a dialogue bubble, maybe you can associate it with a piece of audio. And then we also, in our next game, we're going to use these hashtags. So they're just another really flexible way to add extra metadata without actually having to implement any extra features except just really simple stuff on the game side. So the writer can write those hashtags in if there are ones that have already been in common use, or the person who comes in and adds camera angles or whatever can come in and add extra hashtags to the script in retrospect. And the nice thing is as the writer redrafts, these things are already in the script, so they remain attached to the specific piece of content that they relate to. So I guess you could say it's a non-feature, so we didn't do any work for this, which is great. So we also have some really advanced structuring features. I mentioned before that we don't mind you using go-tos. That's absolutely fine. But if you really must insist on structuring your writing in a sensible way, then you can do that too. We have this concept of tunnels. If you're familiar with programming, that's basically just like calling a function and having a call stack. So you can go into another piece of content, you can go from there into another piece of content, and then it will all automatically unwind and go back to where you were. And we have this cute syntax to allow you to string those things together. So this, again, is sort of an example from Sorcery 3. You might have a section for when the character goes to sleep. It will go there, do some specific content, come back, and then do the same for dreaming and waking. And that's just a really simple way to inject another piece of content into a section. The next structuring feature is really the most advanced feature, and it can be a bit confusing, but it's incredibly powerful. So it's kind of a composition feature. So we call them threads. It's not threading in the computer science definition of the word thread. It's really a way of composing two story threads together so that they all become part of the same moment in the scene. So imagine you have a scene where a character's in a desert, so you bring in the interactions that you can do within that desert scene. But imagine that there could be a character with your protagonist, but she may or she might not be there. But if she is there, you could bring in her conversation options. So it's a way of composing multiple things together in such a way that allows you to gather the choices from those different sections and possibly gather together the content itself, like the description. So you could describe the desert, but you could also describe how Anna's looking, how she's feeling. So, problems with ink. These are our major unsolved problems that we'd really like to tackle at some point, but they're really quite hard. And they're kind of both related. Localization has been a huge problem for us. Well, it's not really a problem that we've even attempted to solve because we've felt that it's basically insurmountable. When you have 650,000 words of content in 80 days, and you go to any localization team, and you describe the complexity of the writing and how much branching there is on a word-by-word basis, what you end up with is the requirement of having a native writer who learns ink for every single language and with no particular ability to check to see whether they've done a good job or whether they've broken the game in the process. So you could extract all the strings from the ink file so they lose their context, but we'd much prefer to allow them to write their own ink files and potentially write these procedural sections themselves so that you get all of the value in the original English version that we wrote. So that's not something that we've ever attempted, though you could say that that's a specific problem to us. Like, you can still use ink. You can use its branching without necessarily varying on a word-by-word basis. And depending on your game, you can still build a graphical game with mechanics and a more sensible quantity of text than what we did. Audio is also a problem. I don't know how much of a problem it would be, mainly because we haven't made an audio-based game yet, but there is the fundamental question of if you've written all of these ink files and you need to record dialogue for it, how do you associate that dialogue back with the ink file, and what happens if you change it? I guess you'd always have to lock it down, but it's not something that we've solved yet. We had this one idea that potentially you could, for localization, translate a particular section. So you could expand this kind of procedural narrative style example and generate the least number of possible versions of it that you possibly can, such that you're generating every possible word that needs to be translated. And then you could translate those versions and then analyze those and bring them back together and form a new piece of ink which encapsulates all of those. I think it's a really interesting idea, but I'm not 100% sure whether it would actually be correct most of the time. But I think it's interesting, and there might be something along those lines that might work. So we're open to suggestions. We went open source on Friday. We've been super excited with the amount of enthusiasm from the developer community. We had a great reaction on Twitter. Our repository on GitHub went onto the GitHub trending page, which was crazy for us. I mean, that's big in the entire development community, let alone in the game industry. So we're really excited about that. So one thing I should say is that I should manage your expectations for the open source project. It is in alpha. We're using it on our next game, but this version of it, the complete rewrite, is kind of untested. We've tested it for our own things. It has unit tests, but it is in alpha, and there are features which are missing. But we hope to keep developing it. We're hoping for contributions from the open source community. What we're really excited to see is a JavaScript implementation of the runtime, so you can use it in web-based games. We'd also love to see templates. So we'd love to see a template of a Sorcery-like map with, so that you can bring your own ink, you can bring your own map art, you can bring your own writing, but have a Unity template engine which is set up, ready to go for that style of game. That would be really exciting to see. So that's the small print. feel free to email me at the address up there. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. Hello.
Hello. So my background is in programming. So from my understanding, I guess that there are things that you can already do in the compiler, like, check syntax errors and stuff like that. And I was wondering if you were able to go any further in validating the input files.
Oh, no, we do. We do. We absolutely. We tell you any errors that you have when you compile your Ink file. Yeah, we do that.
As in, so for instance, I was curious in particular is stuff like analyzing graphs to make sure that every state is reachable, or
yeah. So there's also that's another. It's kind of a nice feature of the language, actually, is that we do detect loose ends. You have to specifically terminate a section with a divert to a special done keyword to say that this is intended to be a loose end. Otherwise, the compiler will warn you if there's a section which still needs to be written. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Cool.
I mean, I mentioned because when I work with content people, I think that one of the things they usually ask about is, hey, are going to make sure that this works without having to manually test everything?
Yeah, so, and that's something we're extremely aware of. And when we wrote the content of Sorcery, one of the things we're proud of, actually, is that John was able to just go ahead and write this stuff. I don't know how much technical ability it takes. I'd be interested to hear from other writers, because Meg and John were both great at it, and they managed to write without having to do too many kind of they didn't create too many syntax errors, and they didn't have to check their files too much. And we did have a fairly modest testing team for Sorcery, but it hasn't actually been a problem for us. And we like to think that it's partly the nature of features like Weave, where it steps in and out automatically and just rejoins, so that you kind of try to sidestep those types of problems. So the format really is designed to try to mitigate those problems at a fundamental level, yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for the talks.
Hey.
So I have a question about scope. So you mentioned like a huge number of cities, 180 cities. Each of them might have a flag called blue or innkeeper's name. Is there a scope way that you don't have to? I mean, so that you can refer to something locally, but you could refer to something in another city if you needed to? Or are the names really much longer than you actually showed?
So there's name spacing in the sense that you can name a section and you can name a subsection, but you can reuse those names of the subsections in a different section, if that makes sense. So you can still have a stitch that's called go in, but the knot might be called innkeeper's house or something. And you can specifically divert to other content using a kind of a dot syntax. So you could divert to innkeeper's house dot go in, for example.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Hello.
Hi. So I was curious. Do you? So basically, in your game, it's just text based. There's no voice, right? There's no voiceover.
No voiceover in those games.
For
no.
obvious reasons, I guess. So is it something you consider for the future? Like.
Yeah, we're actively thinking about voiceover in the future. I don't know. It may not be in our next game or even in our next 2 games, but it's definitely something we're interested in. Yeah, because we're big fans of Firewatch and Oxenfree, for example, which did a really good job of voiceover. So yeah.
And do you think they use a tool that is similar to yours, or is it like more like heavily scripted? I would say.
So I hope they don't mind. We were talking to the Oxenfree guys the other day. Their writing format is a Word document that that the programmer takes and they insert into a flowchart. So I think they could make use of our engine, definitely.
Okay. And I noticed that in your text you always put like either like not projections, but like states of mind and stuff like that. Do you think, do you use this into like image rendering? Like if someone is mad, do you ever see like a person being mad for you?
We haven't up until now, but that's something we're definitely looking at for our next game, yeah.
Okay. And is there a way to debug the narrative? Like, is there a way to see the overarching like narrative some way in some form for your writers?
Do you mean in terms of visualizing the overall structure?
Yeah.
So it's been fairly straightforward for us so far because one of our main features of both Sorcery and 80 Days is that they take place on a geographical map. Okay. And that geographical map has sort of served two functions, both as a way to visualize the amount of content that we have in the game and how you can get to that content. Oh, well, that's just one thing. I thought I had two things. It's one thing, yeah.
Okay. And finally, is there a way to support and ease in writers that are mainly linear into something more systemic like this?
So for writers who are used to writing more traditionally. Yeah, I'd be really interested to see what writers make of it. I mean, if a writer is to understand Markdown, that's kind of the level of complexity that you need to know to just get started. And we do have really advanced features, but I'd be really interested to see what kind of an explicitly very non-technical writer would make of it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks you.
That's okay. Hey.
Hi there. I was interested in particular there was the example of settling down to sleep, I think from Seven Serpents. Yeah. And it looked almost as if that had been designed. At first, it looked like you might sort of plug it in anywhere in the game, so maybe it could come in early in the game or late on. But then looking at it, it seemed like it was a bit more context-specific than that. Have you done any design for scenarios that you could use in a wide variety of situations in the game?
Yeah. So we've definitely thought about it. I mean, I would have to ask my colleague John how much he's used that on Sorcery, because I'm not sure specifically. It's definitely very possible to do. In the case of 80 Days, we were going to have generic reusable content. For example, you're on a ship. It could be any ship around the world. Something happens. We didn't end up doing very much of that. I think there's a little bit of that left in the game. We didn't end up doing much of that at all. If you went to Meg's talk the other day, she explained why that everywhere in the world is very specific, and if you go there and it's generically African or generically Indian, right, then it doesn't work.
But you feel that the language could have supported it quite happily had you gone that way?
Absolutely, yeah.
A couple of questions. One, when you're working on organizing your work, are these ink stories across multiple files where then you have them for
absolutely.
We have each area?
So we have a standard programming style include statement, and 80 Days was the best structured project we had because it was a natural fit for having a separate file for every city, every journey. So we had quite a few ink files in that case, and it was a nice way to split up the project, yeah.
And when you're dealing with tunnels and going from, here's your sleep, here's your dream, here's your wake, how do you signal to come back out to go to
So there's another piece of syntax. You saw that example where you see the arrows going between them. There's just a piece of syntax which just looks like a double arrow, basically, and that's, in programming terms, that's like a return statement.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Hi. You touched upon this briefly, but I'm wondering how it goes back and changes the state of your game. So, for example, I go to the innkeeper and say, can I have a room? And he says, here's your key. How does that key end up in my inventory? And what does the syntax for that look like?
So that's a matter of just setting a variable. I mean, maybe I didn't go into that in much detail at all. There was a very brief example I showed of setting a variable, but you can, it's just a normal variable syntax. So you can declare global variables. You can also have temporary variables, but they're not so useful for that kind of thing.
So does the game engine have to pull to check that variable over and over again?
It's up to the writer of the ink to set a variable and check it using kind of inline syntax or using a multi-line conditional. I mean, these are all features that you can look up in the documentation online, actually. We show you how to do all of that stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thanks.
So in Sorcery, there's sort of shifts of gameplay that doesn't quite match to full interactive narrative, namely the combat and Myers dice. Yeah. Are those actually implemented through Ink? And if not, how do you exactly match the?
Yeah, that's a good question. So In the case of combat, that's actually outside of the Ink engine. When John decided to write a piece of content in 80 days, which was sort of like the cameo of that content from Sorcery. There's a moment where you can have a fight on a train. He did that in the Ink engine. So you can kind of do either, really. You can, in the case of Sorcery, those were specific handmade features specific to that game that weren't written in Ink, but you can write that kind of thing in Ink as well.
So is there a written syntax for exiting out of your Ink story?
Yeah, so that was all written in Ink 1, so we had specific commands for that kind of thing. But if we were to do that again using Ink 2, we would just invent some syntax. It would just be a word, like we could just say start combat in capital letters, and then the game would just check for that string. It wouldn't show it on the output. It would just engage that feature. Okay, it's quite simple. We quite like that way of doing things. Hey.
Hey. So sort of early on in your talk, you were you kind of dismissed these graphical languages, I guess, for something like a lack of expressiveness. But on the other hand, what they do give you is sort of lightweight ability to analyze your narratives and to visualize their structure and see, like, where do you have loops in your narrative? What are the widest and longest paths through it? So have you thought at all about visualization tools for Ink?
Yeah, so, I mean, I was being dismissive, but really, I mean, it's useful for certain applications, certainly. In our particular case, the amount of branching we do means that we've tried sticking it through a tool like GraphViz just to see what it does, and it becomes impossible to read because it's just too complex. In the case of 80 Days in Sorcery, we simply didn't need it. Like we might need it in future if we don't make it kind of a geographical map, because there isn't like a clear mapping between the story content and the geographical location. In that particular case, we might decide to visualize it, like visualize the overall structure. On a micro level, we actually find it easy to visualize in, say, Weave format, depending on what the content is. For like dialogue, we find that actually a lot more straightforward.
Fair enough. All right. Thanks. Great talk.
Thanks.
So I really like the concept where a tag can, like something that you've read before, can influence the results you can pick. Is there any extra logic in there that you could put in to say if they've read this one but haven't read this one but haven't?
Yeah,
read this
absolutely.
one?
So it's got all of the features of a standard programming language. So you can use and, or, brackets, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. Thanks.
Cool. Hey.
Hi. I was wondering if there's any support for like scene preconditions or requirements.
So yeah, we haven't really done that. On 80 Days, we didn't structure the entire game through the Ink file itself. Like, we could have used the Ink file as the spine of the structure of the entire game, but what we ended up having was just using the names of sections and then having a separate file format that was specific to that game, where we'd have a JSON file that we'd make that would just say, that these are the locations and these are the preconditions, and then it would just be up to the game to handle that. But it's definitely it's a really interesting question, and one that I've seen crop up a couple of times. It would be nice to add some kind of like metadata to a section that you can read on the game side. That'd be really useful. It's definitely something to think about. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks very much.